Everyone told 63-year-old Samuel Carter the same thing: leave the mountain alone. 46 acres of his Tennessee farm climbed at nearly 45 degrees, buried beneath thorny brush, loose limestone, and soil that washed away with every summer storm. A track loader nearly slid down the slope, and professionals wanted $31,000 just to attempt clearing it. Then Samuel opened a gate and released 20 strange, woolly pigs onto the mountain. His neighbors thought grief had finally made the old man reckless. But within months, those pigs began doing something no machine could safely accomplish, and the hillside started changing in a way nobody expected. Late May sunlight lay softly across the Tennessee Valley, warming the lower pasture while a dry breeze stirred the tall grass. Above it rose a limestone hillside so steep and tangled that even the morning light struggled to reach the ground. At 63, Samuel Carter had not expected the final working years of his life to begin beneath what the neighbors called the wall of stone. Samuel stood a little over 6 feet, though a lifetime of lifting feed sacks, repairing fences, and working outdoors had given him a slight forward bend through the shoulders. He was lean rather than frail, with long arms, broad hands scarred across the knuckles, and a narrow, angular face browned by decades of sun. His pale gray eyes rarely revealed much, and an uneven iron-gray beard covered a strong jaw that seemed permanently tightened against whatever problem stood in front of him. His dark hair had retreated from his forehead and faded to silver around the temples. Samuel had always been patient with animals and reserved with people. He disliked arguments, rarely raised his voice, and possessed the troublesome habit of becoming more determined whenever someone told him something could not be done. Once, that stubbornness had amused his wife. Now it was one of the few things grief had not taken from him. Helen Carter had been Samuel's wife for 35 years. She was a small woman, barely 5'4", with a slender frame, softly freckled skin, auburn hair that had turned silver at the edges, and warm brown eyes that made even strangers feel welcome. Where Samuel was cautious with words, Helen filled empty rooms with conversation. Where he worried privately, she laughed openly. For years earlier, a brief illness had taken her with a speed Samuel had never learned to accept. Afterward, their house became unbearable in small ways. Her gardening gloves remained beside the back door. A blue coffee cup stayed in the cabinet because Samuel could not bring himself to use it or throw it away. For nearly 2 years, he lived by routine rather than purpose, until he finally returned to the Tennessee property his father had left him. The farm covered 118 acres. Its lower ground was imperfect but useful: pasture, an aging barn, several tired fences, and enough grass for a modest cattle herd. Behind it, however, 46 acres rose violently toward the ridge. Some sections approached 45 degrees. Samuel remembered cattle grazing there when he was young, when scattered hardwoods stood over open grass. Nearly 30 years without management had changed everything. Thorn bushes grew higher than a man's shoulders. Honeysuckle and invasive vines wrapped themselves around saplings. Beneath them lay loose limestone, hidden holes, dead branches, and shallow soil clinging stubbornly between rocks. Samuel first approached the problem as he approached most problems: find the right machine. In early June, he hired Ray Dobbins, a 51-year-old equipment operator from the next county. Ray was short but powerfully built, with thick forearms, a square weather-beaten face, close-cropped brown-gray hair, and a sandy mustache drooping slightly over his upper lip. 27 years operating loaders and bulldozers had made him careful rather than boastful. Years earlier, he had witnessed a co-worker's machine roll on a steep construction embankment. The man survived, but Ray never again confused courage with ignoring gravity. He studied Samuel's hillside for several minutes before unloading the track machine. "I'll try the bottom section," he said. "But if she starts talking to me, I'm listening." Samuel understood. The loader pushed through the first wall of brush easily enough. At 50 feet, it still looked promising. At 70, loose limestone began rolling beneath the tracks. Samuel stood below with his hands on his hips, following every movement. Then, somewhere short of 100 feet, the machine slipped sideways. Only a few inches, but on a 45-degree slope, inches were enough. Samuel felt his stomach drop as the heavy loader leaned toward the valley. Ray immediately lowered the bucket, stabilized the machine, and began backing down with painful slowness. When he finally reached level ground, he shut off the engine and climbed from the cab. Dust coated his jeans. "No piece of ground," Ray said quietly, "is worth rolling a machine down a mountain for." Samuel did not argue. A professional clearing company inspected the hillside the following week. Their estimate was nearly $31,000 for temporary access, brush removal, and stabilization work. Even then, they warned him that heavy machinery could tear away the thin topsoil already struggling to remain between the limestone. Samuel had savings, but $31,000 represented too many years of careful living to gamble on land everyone else considered worthless. So he tried doing it himself. For 3 days he climbed the slope carrying a chainsaw, mattock, pruning tools, and more determination than good sense. He cut vines, dragged thorn bushes downhill, dug around roots, and rolled loose rocks aside. By the third afternoon his back burned, his knees trembled whenever he stopped moving, and 2 blisters had broken beneath his gloves. He walked down to the road and turned around. The cleared area was almost invisible. Samuel laughed once, without humor. Then July brought the rain. A summer storm struck the ridge one afternoon with enough force to turn the farmhouse windows gray. Water rushed down the mountain carrying leaves, twigs, mud, and limestone grit into the pasture below. The next morning Samuel climbed the slope to inspect the damage. Halfway up, he stopped. A fresh erosion channel cut across the ground, nearly 2 feet deep in places. Dark soil had been ripped from between the rocks and carried downhill. Samuel crouched beside the gully and pressed his fingers into the damp earth. For the first time, his concern changed into fear. The 46 acres were not merely useless. They were disappearing. And if enough soil and water continued pouring downhill, the productive pasture below could eventually suffer with them. One neighbor suggested selling the slope to a limestone company. Samuel brought the paperwork home and left it on his kitchen table. For 6 evenings he looked at it while eating dinner alone. On the 7th, searching an old cabinet for property records, Samuel discovered 3 weathered notebooks belonging to his father, Thomas Carter, a lean, hard-working farmer Samuel remembered as a man of few compliments and even fewer wasted words. Thomas had died years earlier, but his handwriting remained unmistakable, narrow black letters recording rainfall, cattle births, fence repairs, and observations about the land. Near the bottom of one yellowed page, Samuel found a single sentence. "Don't put a machine where only 4 feet can hold." Samuel stared at it. Then an old memory surfaced. Years earlier, at a heritage livestock exhibition, he had seen something he initially thought was a sheep. It had a barrel-shaped body, a pig's snout, and a thick coat of curly wool. The breeder had called it a Mangalica. Samuel slowly closed his father's notebook and looked through the kitchen window toward the black silhouette of the mountain. Until that moment, he had been asking how to get a machine up the slope. Now he began wondering whether the answer needed a machine at all. For the next several weeks, Samuel turned his kitchen table into a small research station. His father's notebooks sat beside livestock manuals, printed articles, feed calculations, fencing diagrams, and a yellow legal pad covered with Samuel's increasingly cramped handwriting. He learned that the Mangalica was an old European heritage pig recognizable by its thick, curly coat and strong foraging instinct. What interested Samuel most was not novelty, but behavior. These pigs were active foragers, capable of using powerful snouts to disturb soil, expose roots, and search beneath vegetation. Yet Samuel understood the danger immediately. 20 pigs left uncontrolled on 46 steep acres could create another erosion problem rather than solve one. The animals could not simply be released and forgotten. They would have to be managed. Samuel's plan was deliberately modest. He did not want to plow the mountain with pigs. He wanted them to open selected pockets in the invasive growth, disturb compacted surface soil without exposing the entire hillside, and create enough breathing room for desirable grasses and young trees to compete again. He wrote 3 goals on a sheet of cardboard and pinned it above his desk. Control brush. Open soil. Never leave it bare. Finding the animals took longer than expected. Eventually, Samuel located 2 small heritage breeders reducing their herds and arranged to purchase 20 Mangalicas, 16 females, and 4 castrated males. The cost was significant enough to make him hesitate before signing the checks, but still far below the $31,000 clearing estimate, and unlike rented machinery, the pigs could potentially produce value while they worked. Before they arrived, Samuel spent days preparing the lower section of the hillside. He installed sturdy perimeter fencing where the terrain allowed it, then used portable electric fencing to divide the first accessible area into smaller paddocks. Water would be moved with the herd, and Samuel marked several particularly fragile drainage channels with stakes so the pigs would never remain there long enough to tear them apart. He also established a simple baseline. At several fixed points, he photographed the vegetation, pushed marked steel rods into the soil to monitor erosion, and measured how long water remained pooled after rain. Samuel had no scientific degree, but Thomas Carter had taught him something more basic decades earlier. If a man wanted to know whether something had changed, he had better remember exactly how it looked before he touched it. The livestock trailer arrived on a cool September morning. Its appearance attracted attention almost immediately. One of the neighbors who came to watch was Frank Hensley, 66, a retired cattle farmer who lived 2 properties south. Frank was broad-bellied and bow-legged, with a round red face, white eyebrows, and a trimmed white beard that made his expressions unusually easy to read. He enjoyed teasing people, but rarely meant harm by it. After losing most of his cattle during a financially disastrous drought years earlier, he had become suspicious of unusual farming experiments and particularly suspicious of anything described as innovative. The first Mangalica backed cautiously down the trailer ramp. Frank stared. Then another appeared behind it, covered in thick reddish-brown curls. "Sam," Frank said, "did you buy pigs or sheep?" Samuel looked at the animals, then toward the mountain. "Haven't decided yet. If they climb that hill, I'm calling them goats." Even Samuel laughed, and for a moment he heard something in his own voice that had been absent since Helen died. The joking stopped when the work began. Samuel gave the pigs several days to settle into a lower holding area before introducing them to the first hillside paddock. He watched their feet carefully on the limestone and observed how they handled the slope. They were not magical mountain climbers, and Samuel never treated them as such. They tested uncertain ground, moved around larger rocks, and naturally favored traversing across the slope rather than charging directly upward. That was enough. On the morning Samuel opened the first hillside gate, Frank returned with 2 other neighbors. 20 curly shapes moved through the opening. Then almost nothing happened. One pig immediately found a damp patch and lowered herself into it with an expression of complete satisfaction. Another became fascinated with Samuel's feed bucket and followed him instead of climbing. A third scratched against a fence post. Frank folded his arms. $31,000 is starting to look reasonable. Samuel ignored him, although privately his confidence had begun to wobble. He had spent weeks planning this moment. Now his revolutionary land-clearing crew appeared mostly interested in mud and breakfast. Then Mabel moved toward the brush. She was the largest female in the herd, approximately 3 years old, with a heavy barrel-shaped body, sturdy short legs, dark hooves, and dense reddish-blonde curls that hung around her cheeks like an untidy winter coat. Her small dark eyes gave her a permanently suspicious expression, though she was calm around Samuel and unusually deliberate compared with the younger pigs. She had earned her name from Helen's favorite aunt, another formidable female who had possessed both a large appetite and very little respect for fences. Mabel stopped beside a thorny shrub. Her snout pressed into the leaf litter. She pushed once, then again. Samuel stepped closer. Mabel drove her nose beneath the loose soil, exposing a section of root. She changed position and pushed sideways. Limestone fragments rolled downhill several inches. Another pig noticed the disturbed earth and joined her. Within minutes, several animals were investigating the same patch. Then the root mass lifted. The entire shrub tilted. Frank unfolded his arms. "Well," he murmured. Samuel said nothing. Across the paddock, other pigs had begun rooting beneath vines and leaf litter. They were not clearing the mountain in minutes, and Samuel knew better than to expect that. But something important had happened. The animals had chosen exactly what the machine could not safely reach, the ground beneath the tangled vegetation. Samuel looked at Mabel, whose curly face had already disappeared into another patch of brush. For the first time, his experiment no longer existed only on paper. He had 20 living workers on the hillside, and unlike Ray's tracked loader, these machines appeared perfectly capable of finding their own lunch. By the fourth week, Samuel had stopped measuring the pigs' progress by the number of shrubs they uprooted. Something more interesting was happening beneath their feet. Each morning he walked the occupied paddock before feeding, studying tracks, exposed roots, disturbed stones, and the narrow paths appearing across the hillside. At first they seemed random. Then Samuel noticed that many ran sideways along the slope. The pigs climbed when necessary, but on steeper sections they often traveled diagonally or across the contour, especially between water, shade, and favored feeding areas. Repeated movement pressed shallow trails into the leaf litter. Samuel began marking them with small orange flags. He called them living terraces, although he knew they were nothing like engineered terraces. They were simply narrow animal trails and patches of disturbed ground that interrupted the otherwise uninterrupted downhill surface. During moderate rain, Samuel noticed leaves and small fragments of organic matter collecting behind some of these irregularities rather than washing directly toward the pasture. In other places, loosened soil absorbed water more readily than the crusted surface nearby. The pig's rooting continued to surprise him. Mabel remained the most deliberate worker. She would push her snout beneath leaf litter, follow a root several inches, then lean her considerable weight into it. Younger animals often rushed into the opening she created. Small limestone fragments rolled aside. Occasionally, they exposed flat stones buried beneath shallow soil. Though Samuel quickly learned that the pigs could shift only loose, manageable pieces, not the massive slabs he had once imagined when planning the experiment. One afternoon, he timed himself removing a dense invasive shrub with a mattock. 43 minutes. 2 days later, 3 pigs dismantled a similar root cluster in less than 15. Samuel leaned against the fence and smiled. "Helen," he murmured, "I've finally hired employees who complain less than I do." The humor disappeared several weeks later. Samuel had left the herd in one paddock 2 days longer than planned because a section of electric fence farther uphill needed repair. When he returned after overnight rain, his stomach tightened. Around the water trough, vegetation had almost vanished. Hooves had churned damp earth into mud, and repeated rooting had left several patches of exposed soil. He immediately understood the warning. The pigs were neither a miracle nor a machine with an off switch. Used badly, they could accelerate the very erosion Samuel was trying to prevent. He moved the herd that morning. From then on, rotation became stricter. Water points were shifted frequently, so no single location received constant traffic. Sensitive drainage channels were fenced out entirely. Once a paddock had been disturbed enough, Samuel removed the pigs, scattered a mixture of locally appropriate grasses and herbaceous plants over selected openings, then laid thin branches across the most vulnerable bare patches. The branches slowed surface movement, discouraged the pigs from immediately returning, and helped hold leaf litter in place. Frank Hensley began visiting without jokes. One afternoon, he stood beside Samuel looking through an area the pigs had left 6 weeks earlier. When the experiment began, the same ground had been a dark wall of vines and thorn. Now sunlight reached patches of forest floor. Several young oaks, previously wrapped in climbing vines, stood free beneath the taller canopy. "I can see 50 yards through there," Frank said. Samuel nodded. "Couldn't see 20 feet last year." Frank scratched his white beard. "Still think they're ugly. They don't seem troubled by your opinion." By late spring of the following year, Samuel had enough before and after photographs to see what memory alone could not reliably show. The hillside was not becoming bare. It was becoming more varied. Dense invasive thickets had been interrupted by grass, leaf litter, exposed limestone, young hardwoods, and open patches where sunlight reached the ground. Some areas needed additional seeding. Others regenerated without Samuel touching them. His most important observation involved water. At several monitoring points, Samuel compared compacted, untouched ground with rested areas that had been lightly rooted and subsequently covered again by vegetation and litter. When he poured equal amounts of water inside simple metal rings pressed into the soil, the treated ground generally accepted it faster. The experiment was crude, and Samuel knew it proved little scientifically, but the pattern matched what he saw during rainfall: less immediate surface runoff in properly rested areas. Then, in late June, the ridge disappeared beneath charcoal clouds. The storm arrived violently. Samuel stood beneath the barn roof listening to rain hammer the metal until memories of the previous summer returned. muddy water racing downhill, soil collecting in the pasture, the 2-foot erosion channel that had convinced him he was losing the mountain. He pulled on his raincoat. Frank, who had driven over before the storm, stared at him. "You're not climbing up there." "No." Samuel walked toward the bottom of the slope instead. Water was coming down. Nothing could prevent that on a mountain. But rather than gathering immediately into several muddy torrents, much of it moved unevenly through vegetation. Leaf litter, small trails, rocks, roots, and the protected drainage areas Samuel had left intact. He waited at the place where brown water had entered the pasture the year before. A stream eventually reached it. Samuel crouched. The water was faintly cloudy, but he could see pieces of grass beneath it. Frank stood silently behind him. Far above, inside a sheltered paddock away from the strongest drainage channel, Mabel and the other Mangalicas moved between the trees, their wet curls dark against the green hillside. Samuel watched the water for another minute. He had not defeated erosion. He knew better than to make such a claim. But the mountain was no longer shedding soil the way Samuel remembered. For the first time, Frank had nothing humorous to say. Neither did Samuel. Some victories were quiet enough that speaking only made them smaller. The following spring, Samuel noticed the hillside had acquired a sound it had not possessed when he returned to Tennessee. One April morning, while checking a fence above the second paddock, he stopped because something was hammering against an old oak. A red-bellied woodpecker moved around the trunk, disappearing behind it and returning seconds later. Farther downhill, smaller birds searched through leaf litter that had accumulated beneath trees once buried in vines. Samuel remained still for several minutes. He had spent 2 years watching what the pigs removed. Now, for the first time, he began paying attention to what returned. Wildflowers appeared in openings where sunlight reached the ground. Bees worked among them, followed by butterflies and other insects Samuel could not name. More surprising were the seedlings. Young oaks appeared beneath mature trees. Hickory seedlings pushed through leaf litter, and several persimmons emerged near places where wildlife had apparently deposited seed. Samuel marked some with small stakes because he knew how easily a careless boot, or a curious Mangalica, could erase several years of growth in seconds. The changes interested Dr. Rebecca Lane, a county extension specialist Samuel contacted after showing her his photographs and rainfall notes. Rebecca was 47, tall and narrow-shouldered, with short dark brown hair streaked with gray, lightly freckled skin, and rectangular glasses over sharp green eyes. She spoke carefully, disliked dramatic conclusions, and had developed a habit of asking for measurements whenever someone used words such as miracle, ruined, or perfect. Years earlier, she had watched a demonstration farm lose topsoil after an enthusiastic manager overstocked livestock on wet ground. Since then, she had become particularly skeptical of any grazing method advertised as universally beneficial. When Rebecca first climbed Samuel's hillside, she spent more time looking down than around. "That's encouraging," Samuel said. "What is?" "You haven't fallen yet." Rebecca smiled. "Give me another 100 feet." She selected 3 comparison areas: ground the pigs had never entered, an area disturbed recently, and a paddock that had been rested for almost a year. They examined surface cover, rooting depth, litter accumulation, and basic infiltration behavior. Samuel expected the oldest rested paddock to look dramatically superior in every measurement. It did not. Some untouched areas remained stable beneath established vegetation and required no intervention at all. Recently rooted sections, particularly those with exposed soil, were vulnerable until vegetation returned. But several properly managed and rested areas showed less surface crusting, better litter contact, and faster infiltration during their simple field tests. Rebecca crouched beside one sample and crumbled the soil between her fingers. "This isn't proof that pigs fix mountains," she said. Samuel nodded. "I figured you'd ruin my slogan." "They can create opportunity," she continued. "They can also create a disaster if you leave too many in one place." That sentence stayed with Samuel. That evening he wrote it into his notebook. From then on, his management became more conservative. He divided several paddocks again, sometimes allowing the herd only a few days before moving it. Fragile areas were skipped entirely. After the pigs opened dense vegetation, Samuel seeded selected patches and then waited. Sometimes grass responded. Sometimes native plants arrived without assistance. Sometimes nothing useful happened, and he adjusted again. The lesson became almost embarrassingly simple. The pigs were not restoration. They were one tool within it. By the third year after the 20 Mangalicas arrived, Samuel could walk sections of the hillside without fighting through a wall of thorn. Green bands crossed portions of the slope. Leaf litter gathered beneath released hardwoods. Young oak, hickory, and persimmon stood among older trees, while the narrow animal paths followed irregular lines across the contour. Samuel had also learned to leave some places alone. One afternoon that autumn, Earl Whitmore drove up the gravel lane. Earl, 71, owned land west of Samuel's property and had been among the first people to suggest selling the hillside to a limestone company. He was a thin, slightly stooped man with a long nose, deeply sunken blue eyes, and white hair combed straight back from a spotted forehead. Earl was not cruel. He was simply practical to the point of pessimism. After surviving 2 farm recessions and watching his brother lose land to debt, he trusted money already earned more than promises about tomorrow. Samuel took him to the same lower road where they had once looked up at an impenetrable wall of vegetation. Earl stopped. 3 years earlier, the hillside had appeared almost black beneath tangled brush. Now sunlight passed between trunks. Grasses covered selected openings. Young trees rose through patches of leaf litter, and narrow green lines seemed to wrap themselves around the mountain. Earl pushed his hands into his jacket pockets. "I'll be damned," he murmured. Samuel waited. Earl studied the slope for another minute. Maybe the hill was never the problem. Samuel looked toward the ridge. A few Mangalicas were visible through the trees, their curly coats glowing bronze in the late afternoon light. "No," Samuel said. "Maybe we kept asking it to become something it was never meant to be." The 2 older men stood without speaking. Samuel had once imagined success as turning the mountain into productive flat ground. 3 years had taught him something different. The hillside did not need to become a field. It needed the chance to become healthy ground again. Samuel never turned the 46 acres into a field. By the 4th year, he understood that doing so would have meant destroying much of what he had spent years trying to restore. Instead, he began working with the mountain's shape. On the broadest and most stable bands of ground, he planted small groups of chestnut, persimmon, pawpaw, and several fruit varieties suited to Tennessee's climate and drainage. The trees did not march uphill in straight commercial rows. Samuel placed them roughly along contours, adjusting every planting site for rock, existing roots, sunlight, and water movement. Some sections received no trees at all. The steepest ground remained wooded. Fragile drainage areas stayed covered with native grasses, shrubs, and leaf litter. Old hardwoods were left standing wherever they remained healthy. What slowly emerged was not a conventional orchard, but something closer to a patchwork. Woodland, forage, fruit and nut trees, open ground, and narrow paths stitched together across the slope. Samuel kept the Mangalicas, though their role changed. They were rotated only through appropriate sections and excluded from young orchard blocks whenever rooting might damage newly planted trees. Their value now came from several directions. They continued suppressing unwanted vegetation in selected paddocks, and Samuel sold a limited number of heritage animals and breeding stock through local buyers. The income was never spectacular, but it helped cover fencing, feed during lean periods, seed, replacement water lines, and orchard supplies. More importantly, Samuel no longer faced the choice between spending tens of thousands of dollars on heavy clearing equipment or simply abandoning the hillside. The pigs had become part of a management system rather than a one-time solution. Dr. Rebecca Lane visited again during the 5th year. She walked slowly across one of the established sections, stopping beside a young chestnut whose leaves had begun turning gold. "You know what people are going to say?" she told Samuel. "That I've invented mountain bacon?" Rebecca laughed. "They're going to say the pigs restored 46 acres. Samuel shook his head. That version bothered him because it was easier than the truth. The pigs had opened vegetation and disturbed selected ground. But Samuel had built fences, moved water, washed weather, seeded vulnerable patches, protected drainage channels, rested paddocks, preserved trees, changed plans, and sometimes done nothing at all because doing nothing was the better decision. "They didn't save the mountain," he said. "They taught me to stop fighting it." By then, visitors occasionally came to see the property. Samuel showed them the original photographs first. In those images, The hillside looked like a dark wall behind the pasture, tangled so densely that the ground itself was almost invisible. Then he took them to the lower road. The contrast required little explanation. Green vegetation now covered much of the managed ground. Native trees of different ages stood among the older hardwoods. Orchard plantings followed the safer contours rather than forcing geometric lines onto the slope. The mountain was still steep, still rocky, and still capable of punishing careless decisions. Samuel considered that part of the success. He had not made the mountain easier. He had become better at listening to it. Years passed. One October afternoon, when Samuel was nearing 70, he climbed to one of the higher stable benches. Age had added more silver to his beard and deepened the lines around his pale eyes. He stopped more often on steep climbs now, though pride ensured he pretended each pause was for inspecting a fence. Below him, autumn had begun painting the hillside. Chestnut leaves glowed yellow-brown. Persimmons hung orange among dark branches. Pawpaw leaves had turned soft gold. Beyond them stood the old farmhouse where he had once imagined growing old beside Helen. Samuel still missed her. Time had not removed that. It had simply changed grief from something he carried in front of him into something that walked quietly beside him. A few yards away, Mabel rested beneath a chestnut. She was old now. Her once thick reddish curls faded and coarse around the face. Her movements had slowed, and Samuel no longer expected much work from her. She had earned retirement more convincingly than he had. Samuel scratched behind her ear. "You were supposed to clear brush," he said. Nobody said anything about teaching lessons. Mabel opened one eye, decided the conversation contained no food, and closed it again. Samuel laughed. Years earlier, he had considered paying more than $30,000 to put heavy machines on a slope where one track loader had already nearly slipped. The alternative had arrived on short legs, covered in ridiculous curls, demanding fencing, clean water, careful management, and an impressive amount of food. But the greatest return was not measured in pork, fruit, timber, or dollars. Samuel had come to Tennessee believing that Helen's death had divided his life into two parts: the years that mattered and whatever remained afterward. The hillside had once seemed much the same, 46 acres whose useful years were already gone. Both assumptions had been wrong. Neglected did not mean dead. Different did not mean worthless. And starting again did not require becoming what one had been before. Samuel looked down across the mountain orchard, the woodland, and the green contour bands winding through the trees. He thought about how desperately he had once wanted to flatten, clear, and control that ground. Not every piece of land needed conquering. Some needed understanding. Perhaps people did too. Sometimes, Samuel thought, God did not make the mountain smaller. Sometimes he gave a person another way to climb. Below him lay 46 acres once dismissed as useless. Now the mountain was alive, productive, and still unmistakably a mountain. And Samuel would not have wanted it any other way. Sometimes, God does not perform a miracle by making the mountain disappear. Sometimes, he simply shows us another way to climb it. Samuel spent years looking at that steep Tennessee hillside and seeing 46 acres of failure. The ground was too rocky, the slope was too dangerous, and the machines he trusted could not safely reach the places that needed help most. He wanted the mountain to become easier. He wanted it flatter, cleaner, more useful. But perhaps the mountain was never the thing that needed to change first. Perhaps Samuel was. 20 strange, woolly pigs did not arrive like a miracle from heaven. They did not transform the land overnight. Samuel still had to build fences, carry water, move the herd, protect young trees, make mistakes, and begin again when something failed. But those animals helped him see what had been there all along. The hillside was not worthless. It was simply asking to be understood differently. And perhaps our lives are like that too. There are seasons when the road suddenly becomes steeper than we expected. Someone we love is no longer sitting beside us. A career ends. Money becomes tight. Our health or strength changes with age. Children grow up and move away. A dream we carried for decades does not happen the way we imagined. In those moments, we may pray for God to flatten the mountain. We ask Him to remove the difficulty, restore what was lost, or return our lives to the way they used to be. But sometimes His answer is quieter. Sometimes God does not give us our old life back. He gives us the wisdom to build something meaningful with the life that remains. Samuel could never bring Helen back. No harvest, no orchard, and no green hillside could fill the chair she once occupied. But grief did not mean his life had become useless. Just as neglected ground was not dead ground, a wounded heart was not an empty one. There was still something left to grow. Maybe you are standing beneath your own impossible hillside today. Maybe there is something in your life you have quietly labeled too late, too broken, too difficult, or too far gone. Samuel's story offers a simple reminder. Do not confuse a difficult season with the end of your story. God may not remove every stone from your path. He may not answer in the way you expected. Sometimes the miracle is not that the mountain moves. Sometimes the miracle is discovering that, with faith, patience, and another step forward, you can still climb. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may be facing a mountain of their own. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and what lessons Samuel's journey left with you. And if you believe stories of faith, courage, second chances, and ordinary people finding extraordinary hope still matter, please subscribe to the channel and become part of this community. May God bless you, your family, and your home. May He give strength to those carrying grief, hope to those beginning again, and light to anyone who cannot yet see the road ahead. And when the mountain before you seems too steep to climb, may God remind you, the miracle may not be waiting at the top. Sometimes, it begins the moment you discover another way forward.